one of the great lies perpetrated was that pro rata was a good thing for the founder. Pro rata is a one-way option for the VC.
Welcome to NY Seed Round, the podcast for curious startup founders.
You can be a home run hitter, and you know there are some, but sometimes you just got to manufacture runs.
In each episode, I dive deep into the learnings and mistakes made by the world-class investors and operators who have helped make the New York City tech ecosystem what it is today. Do you think that founders ask their potential investors enough questions? I feel like there's always pressure to like pitch, sell. This week, I spoke with Micah Rosenbloom. He's the managing partner for Founder Collective. Founder Collective is a seed-stage venture capital fund with historic investments in companies like Uber, Airtable, and Venmo. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to Micah was a recent essay that he published called The Many Incentives of VCs. In the piece, Micah helps founders walk through the various types of VCs that they could interact with as they're raising money and the things to be aware of in these conversations. And then we talk about his reflections and thoughts on a really challenging topic for founders, and that's when to wind down your company and how to do it. Catch us up to where you are today. Like, how did you get started? What's your journey?
Yeah, so thanks for having me here.
Yeah.
It's fun to be 3 blocks away. Actually, we're like 1 block from my first office for Founder.
Oh, amazing.
It was 580 Broadway, except all these Broadway entrances were moved to Crosby so that they could use the retail.
That's right.
And Crosby was, kind of a cooler street than...
you got to move. We need an ice cream museum. We must move.
Yeah, exactly. And very entrepreneurial, optimized space. I digress. So, but yeah, 580 Broadway was our first office. My journey, like Eric, Dave, Amanda, my partners at Founder Collective, is one of starting as a founder and operator. I, after college, almost immediately went to, I got kind of excited about the dot-com boom.
Yeah.
And a couple buddies and I, we took off our, paintings or cheap posters on the wall and changed them to whiteboards and started coming up with ideas. This was in LA. This is not a long time ago, in 1999, and came up with this idea for Handshake, which predates the current Handshake.com, but was basically a services marketplace. So I think a poor man's Thumbtack. We made a lot of mistakes. I can go into it, but the gist of it was we were a consumer marketplace where you would book house cleaner, carpet cleaner,
right?
And we would do end to end. So, I would come out and clean. No, but we would do the pricing, the whole thing. And we went very horizontal. We were trying to enable the yellow pages at the time.
Right.
And
so I feel like I see where this is going.
Yeah.
Almost too much, lack of focus.
Too much, lack of focus. Yeah. We should have focused much more on lead gen. I don't think the small businesses were ready. Yeah. We were faxing many of the jobs to the small businesses. And so about 2 years in, we pivoted to B2B. I'm actually working on a piece right now about pivoting.
Yeah.
We pivoted to B2B, and I think that was actually a better business, but we had already spent so much money. We had kind of we were overcapitalized and...
Were you burnt out at that point, or?
I literally wrote about that this morning.
Yeah.
A little bit burnt out, a little bit, we didn't have the right team for a B2B SaaS company. We didn't even know we didn't call it SaaS at the time, but we were basically scheduling and appointment software, and that was just a very different business. So about 6 months into that, 9 months, and we got some clients, but we basically ran out of cash.
Yeah.
And so some of the employees went to customers. We, licensed out software, but we didn't make anything. So I went to business school, and early on, I met Eric and Dave, who are, my partners in the fund. And Eric and I had both come off entrepreneurial adventures.
Yeah.
And kind of in sync said, would you do it again? And we said, if the stars align. And I think I very much feel that way about startups. The stars have to align. A lot has to go right. But we worked hard to make the stars align. So the second year of business school, we looked at different applications and different ideas we had. And we were kind of randomly going over to MIT to recruit engineers because neither of us were technical. And we met a guy who we didn't think was, thought he was a student, shaggy hair or whatever.
Yeah.
Professor, it turns out, tenured faculty member. And he was working in 3D imaging and 3D scanning. And it was sort of we needed a push in a direction. And we were like, okay, so here's something.
Right.
What can we do with it? And it wasn't an easy way to start a company because it's sort of like a solution looking for a problem.
Right.
But I think because we were in business school, we were conditioned to think logically about applications and how to build a business. So it kind of worked out. And so we were looking at all these different applications, and we eventually settled on this opportunity in dentistry, which is random, but all startups are. So we had randomly, I'm going the fast forward version, we'd randomly met the founder of Invisalign, who said one of the problems we're having was a relatively new company, newish, two MBAs who had founded the company. Everyone knows what they do, but they were taking dental molds, which is how most of dentistry in the past worked, plaster model, pour it up. And they were like, we'd really love to just scan and send it to our servers in California so we can make the aligners. We were like, sure, can you do that? And we were like, can we do that? Sure, we can do that.
We can do that.
Yeah, we can do that.
We just talked to my associates.
Yeah, exactly. It turned out it was like a 2-year development to get there.
Okay, gotcha.
But that was sort of like what got the ball rolling. And then we were able to like go to the trade shows and really zero in on a particular application. We called every dentist. I mean, we pitched to venture capitalists who said, and it was really hard to raise money because we were like a dental company. But one VC was like, so you guys are dental students? And we like smirked and we're like, well, no, but we've learned a lot, like we sunk our teeth into it.
Right.
Sorry, I had to. So, it was just like a really, you said this, contrasted to the lack of focus in the first business. It was so focused that I think that was a real asset. We also we hired people with lots of different skills. It was hardware, it was software. We built the company in Boston. We got to meet all the execs in the industry. And a few years in, we started getting interest from big dental companies and ultimately sold the company to 3M, which made a lot of the materials.
Right.
By the way, a funny thing is our original pitch deck, we had a picture of the Egyptians and we said, these processes haven't changed since the pyramids. And it was true. Like the plaster, like gold crowns are like literally the same process they've been using for like 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So talk about disrupting.
That's right.
Old tech. So after we sold that, we started meeting a few entrepreneurs here and there, particularly in Boston. But our good friend from business school, Chris Dixon, had moved to New York, and my wife is from here, and I started coming down here quite a bit. And, we just saw the rise of this ecosystem. And so I moved here, and around, about a year or two earlier, Eric and Dave had this concept for Founder Collective, which, was sort of to keep the ethos that we had as angels, because we'd started investing together, maybe 8 or 9 companies, as a group. And we thought, how do we keep that same ethos? Like all of us builders, jeans and t-shirts, it always really felt like when you were fundraising, when I was fundraising for Bronze Ace, and certainly for Handshake in New York, I mean, it was literally like going to Wall Street.
Yeah.
I mean, it was suits and high rises, and it was very different than it was today. And certainly in Sand Hill Road, it was, it was an old boys club.
Yeah.
And we felt there was a real opportunity to change that. And so, and obviously the industry has changed a lot, but I think just that insight around, particularly Eric and Dave around 2009 was a good one. And New York was a good one.
Yeah.
I think really seeing the rise of New York.
You were one of the early players here.
I mean, so I got here, started investing 2011, 2012. And it was, it started as an ad tech town.
Yeah.
We would see, we invested in Moat and Integral Ad Sciences, which was, different name back then. I remember one of the first investments I went to look at was MakerBot in Brooklyn, which is a 3D printer company. We ended up investing and they sold. And
can you do Invisalign teeth?
Yeah, exactly. No, it's true. I was like, can you print out the aligners?
Yeah.
He actually was Bree Pettis, who's an early New York entrepreneur, amazing guy. And it was the first hardware company I'd ever seen in New York. It was actually the first company I visited in Brooklyn.
Oh, wow.
And he called it the Bot Cave. And I was just like, wow, I had, it had a feeling of the Boston techiness with the New York, zhuzh.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is going to be something. But the first demo he showed me, that was a 3D printer, but he showed me printing frosting on a cupcake in an autumn. He was like, what do you want me to do? I was like, this is either going to be he was like, well, they'll be at restaurants. I mean, this is the interesting things about startups, right?
Yeah.
We start in one place and, are they pivots or are they just being entrepreneurial and figuring out a way? I don't know. But yeah, that was my introduction to New York tech. And I just got really excited because it was very friendly and collegial and very much like we're in it together. My experience in Boston and the Bay was not that. It was a little more professional. And I felt like here, I mean, some of the early guys like Mike Brown and Nahal and, and obviously Fred and the USV guys, it just felt like we were building something as a community, and that was special. Yeah. And I think it still is. Right. But I think it's amazing to think what's transpired over the last decade.
That's right. When you were building the company, for dentists, I'm curious, because our CRO taught me, he was an AE in ZocDoc, and he describes how did customer research meant we all booked a ton of doctor's visits. So did you guys just have the cleanest teeth in the world because you kept going to dental appointments?
I mean, we would really sit, because a lot of what we were doing was scanning crowns and bridges. So we would sit at the goriest, gooky, the thing that actually really I did a lot of was I was the patient.
Yeah.
So I would have to open my mouth for like hours a day. Because we didn't want to, for liability reasons, scan anybody else on the staff. I was a founder, so like if they killed me, and the device was overheating. So we, I think one of the learnings was you need real sort of like scrappy, engineers. And so our head of engineering at the time was sort of a MacGyver solution. He basically took a fish tank pump and a cold water basin and started circulating cold water through the device.
Yeah.
But then it's leaking all over me, and I have all these pictures, by the way, and we're trying to get the scanner to work, and I'm like, this feels like 6th grade science fair.
Right.
Like, is this thing gonna ever work? And but yeah, I mean, you asked about like just we went to every trade show. We probably spent hundreds of hours with dentists. We had dentists come in. We bought an operatory, like a dental chair and a light off eBay or Craigslist, moved it into the office. I would make a plug for IRL work. I think there would be no way to build that company remotely. Obviously, it was hardware and there was a lot of physicality to it, but just the sheer, it was so interconnected.
Right.
How you use the product, how we built the product, the user interface. Literally, like where you put because it was a computer on a cart, like where you position the cart. It was a real magical experience building this thing, building the company, and then we became part of a big company, and that was a different experience.
That makes sense. Oh, one other question though about the motivation.
Yeah.
It's like you sell to 3M, and like theoretically, like that's a life-changing decision. And I'm curious, why did you jump back in? Like you could easily have like rode into the sunset. Before we hear their answer, I just want to take a moment to thank everybody for being a part of the NYC round journey since we got started earlier this year. For more founder and investor-driven content, like and subscribe. Now back to the interview.
Yeah. But why stay to 3M for 4 years? I think entrepreneurs, look, we've entered a world where I think things are perceived as more transactional. Like I sell, I make money, I go on, I do the next thing, or I ride off into the sunset. Right. I think entrepreneurs aren't totally motivated by money.
Right.
I think entrepreneurs want to see their baby grow and be used. I think that is, there was an old question that the VCs used to ask, do you want to be rich or do you want to be king?
Right.
I think the VCs wanted to hear rich. And I'm not sure the answer is king, but I think the answer was for us, like we wanted thousands of dentists and patients to experience our product.
Right.
Tens of that. And so it was really important to me. I mean, there were employees who stayed a decade later at 3M. And I think it wasn't like I was dying to work at a large company. It was more, I wanted to see my baby's next chapter.
Yeah.
I got a lot of satisfaction. We then, and I think a lot of founders don't talk about this, but actually I think a lot of founders do feel this way. Like I got to launch our product in Germany, Japan, UK, Canada, France, Italy, travel to these places, translators, you don't get that experience in most startups. And I was like, wow, like this is amazing. Like our thing, here, these guys in Italy are buying 20 units of our product, and like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I'm here to see that.
Yeah, 100%. I want to pivot to some of your views on venture overall.
I don't have any views. I don't write much.
Podcast over.
Yeah.
You've recently written to the extent, you've said, VCs looking for Google or Facebook exits versus like the 3X. 2-3X type of exit. It requires different strategies and tactics.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think some of it correlates to fund size, which is, I think as these funds have gotten larger, there's almost no way a couple $100 million exit makes a difference. It doesn't move the needle. And yet, if you look at the data, many companies, including my own experience, exited a couple $100 million. I mean, yes, there are the outliers at billions. And I think we had this like artificially large number of unicorns, which we all now readily admit what was inflated. And so people built their funds along that. But I think it's also just in terms of when you meet a company at the seed, I find it difficult to evaluate whether this is the next $1 billion company. The question I'm trying to ask myself is, can I get a 10x on my money, and can I build a great company? And there's so many permutations on how companies are going to exit and build. But I think what's happened is there's a little bit analytically it is the power law. I think that may lead you to the wrong conclusion. That may lead you. What's that?
How so?
It may lead you to basically, first of all, it will change the advice you give to startups, because you need them to be billionaire or bust. And so you've got to put capital to work. So the incentive for most investors is to put more capital in and hope this thing exits at multiple billions. Even if the thing, and we've seen this now, and so what happens is you don't even have the conversation about, every firm, and they're lying if they don't say this, has a bunch of companies that in the last 5 years could have exited, most likely would have exited for several $100 million, maybe even close to $1 billion, but not $1 billion or not in the billions. And those opportunities never were realized because the conversations didn't even happen. It would have been absurd, and I kick myself. It wouldn't have been absurd to say, hey, guys, we're a $100 million business. We're growing, maybe we should see if there's any buyers out there. Yeah. That was blasphemy.
But the incentives are off, which is what you wrote about.
It was what I wrote about. I think how it translates. So I think you don't open yourself up to the positive, which is, you said this too, life-changing to the founders. And so you kind of make it harder for them to achieve those outcomes. And then I think in the very beginning, I think there's this perception, and maybe I'm not as good at spotting these as others, but you've got to go for the most ambitious, big picture vision that seems to fulfill, and often I think leads you to believe that maybe the multi-time founders are the ones who are going to build the next. It's not to say that isn't true. I just think that's a very hard rubric to, at day one, figure out who the next Zuck is.
Yeah.
I'm not sure those guys knew. I'm not sure Zuck knew.
Right.
And so I think it just and so I take a more, sports are always cliche, but a little bit of, I don't know if are you a sports?
Yeah.
Baseball or
like basketball, football, hockey, because I'm from Raleigh. So
okay.
Go
so we'll use basketball. I think it's shoot a lot of layups. Yeah. Go. And that's not to say startups are hard. The one I was going to use is actually baseball, which is, you can be a home run hitter, and you there are some. But sometimes you just got to manufacture runs, get to first, get to second, take a walk here and there. And that distribution, I did write a post about this. I need to update it. That is the distribution we see, which is some smaller exits, some big exits. And it doesn't preclude anybody from becoming the multi-billion-dollar companies. It's just that it's a distribution. It's not, it is power law from an outcome standpoint, but I don't want to operate that way.
Right.
'Cause that's sort of like saying it's a lottery, and the only thing that matters is, the far outliers. And I think in my estimation, by the way, the difference between a 2x and, is those smaller exits get you to 1 to 2x. Now, I'm a smaller fund, so it can make a difference.
Yeah.
I think at a larger fund, that math is much harder.
That makes sense. So yeah, you wrote the Many Incentives of VCs. It's a great piece. We'll link it down below. First, why was now the right time to write this piece? What were you feeling? What were you seeing?
Yeah. It's a good question. Sometimes I just wake up with an idea and I'm I just got to write
fair
it.
enough.
I think I was seeing, look, it's been a little bit hard at the Series A. It's getting a little easier, but it's been a little bit hard at the Series A. It seemed to me like a binary market where some companies just, partially if they were in AI or in a hot sector, and if they were growing quickly, would get rounds and lots of term sheets. And then, it's been much harder for some of our other companies. And as a seed and seed only fund, we really rely on the rest of the capital markets for Series A's and B's. Our whole model is set up that way. And I was finding that a lot of companies were hearing different things from different investors. And I was just sort of a commentary on really the asset class has matured in a way where I think it really was a much more simple calculation. Do you believe this thing can generate a return?
Yeah.
And I think there's just a lot more variables at play, especially given some of these firms are much more institutionalized. And I think it's rolled into this new phenomenon of VC as like a career and industry.
Yeah.
That is not a commentary on it being bad. It's just very different than how it was, and probably is net positive. But this idea that like some investors may be optimizing for the next job. They may be thinking about the new fund they want to start.
Yeah.
They may be, it may be tough to sell a big investment internally, so they go to a smaller investment or a more pedigreed, someone said to me, the old expression, you never get fired for buying IBM. There's a little bit of that going on in venture capital.
So literally everything except can this business like succeed, it's other things that are impacting.
Yeah, it's not, I don't want to say it as so cynically or it maybe they're more, look, there are always variables at play. It's a very human business. It's a business without a lot of data. So naturally, if someone just gravitates to a founder or, we've seen this, like someone's like, oh, I'm really interested in dentistry because like I made money in another dental opportunity. Like that's going to matter.
Yeah.
And it always did. That hasn't changed. But I think these other incentives as the industry has matured and institutionalized, maybe it was just me reflecting on that as like, cranky old person shanking my stick, being like, wow, things have, the dynamics have shifted. And I think it's important for entrepreneurs to know that. And, it's like any good salesperson. If you can realize what are the objections and what are the incentives on the other side, I think you're better at selling your round.
That makes sense. In your answer, you mentioned one of the things you bring up in the piece, which is the junior VCs and their incentives. It almost like brought me down this path of like, I got to ask you, because it is a highly debated topic and it is related to what you wrote about.
Yeah.
But you're a founder. Do you take meetings with VC associates? And explain why.
Yeah. So I actually, you may expect a different answer. I think you should. And the reason is, I think at a lot of firms, including our firm, the associates have a lot of trust and frankly, perspective that a lot of maybe some of the more senior partners don't have, especially on new stuff. So we rely very heavily on the opinions. I would say their opinions. We have a principal, Brent, in Boston. We're actually recruiting for an associate here in New York. We always have 2 MBA associates on staff. I listen to I talk to them every day. I listen to what they have to say. They meet a lot of companies and our companies. And so I think building surface area in a fund is important. I think you have to separate, are they just fact finding and building a market map, or do they actually have a say into the partnership? That may vary fund to fund. But I think to blanket say don't talk to associates is a mistake.
Well, in the piece you do talk about like the incentives that VC associates have.
Yeah. And I think that's true. I think I would come back to like try to get a read on that.
Yeah.
I think now that we're back, hopefully for the most part, in terms of like, IRL meetings and I think it's really important to go meet VCs. I think it's this, sales 101 is like, hey, I'm going to be in the Bay. Coincidentally, I'm going to be in your neighborhood next week. I think you got to do that. I think if you can get a face-to-face with a VC, it's always better to sell that way. Now, they may push back and say, hey, it's meeting 1, let's just do a Zoom.
Yeah.
As soon as you can get face-to-face, in my opinion, at least in my experience, that's how you can get a better read on, like, what is the motivation here.
Do you think that founders ask their potential investors enough questions? I feel like there's always pressure to, like, pitch, and sell, but, like...
I think founders should be asking, maybe not all on meeting 1, but by meeting 2, hey, where are you in your fund? How big is your fund? I think they should be doing research, talking to other founders in their portfolio. They should read a lot of their stuff. I think they should push on their process. Like, how do you make a decision? Respectfully, but it's a two-way sell.
Yeah, it's, your process. But the other reason I ask about that specifically is, like, in your piece, you talk about, depending on the type of firm that you accept funding from, it could create incentives that put you in a difficult position. For example, you highlight, they could, your investor could push for a merger before you're ready, or they could push for you to, launch a product before you're ready. But like, what are the questions that founders should ask to suss that out? Well, even sometimes, this is a little bit related, but you have a lot more domain focused VCs now. And so let's say you're pitching to a fintech,
VC and you don't really think of your business as fintech, maybe there's a fintech angle to it, but they start to see it as a fintech business. And I think the problem could become either they're never going to get there because at the end of the day, they're going to realize it's 80% software or 20 or whatever. It's not really a fintech company. Or they do invest. And then, one day everybody wakes up and says, wait a second, like as the investor perception was, it was this and your perception is that. And so I think that's another area where you got to quickly suss out, like, is this a high probability target? It really is sales. Like, is this a high probability target? Some of it is just a numbers game too, which is you got to talk to, we were saying to our Series A companies, you got to have like 15 conversations. Now I'm saying like, you got to have 30. It really is that. But you start from a list of 200, you winnow it down based on input from people and likelihood of if it's $1 billion fund and you're raising $3 million, probably not a great fund to pitch.
Especially for first-time founders, though. I feel like the piece is just it just offers so much value, because then you talk about like, be wary of.
You say that to all your guys.
Yeah, there you go. Be wary of taking investment from growth investors at the earliest stage too. You bring up things like, well, you get enough attention to detail. You may set yourself up if you don't hit certain growth metrics. It could be a negative signal that they don't follow on.
Yeah.
I want you to take the opposite case of your essay and give me the bullish reason for why an early stage investor should talk to a growth investor.
I think the bullish case is if you're going to need a lot of capital, and you think, I think in most cases this is not the.
You think you'll be Facebook essentially?
I think if you think you'd be Facebook, or I think there are markets where you're going to need a depth of, if there's a big regulatory component. It's kind of why biotech often raises from large funds from the get-go, because it's just going to take so much capital. They have regulatory connections. You're going to need those. I think if your business looks a little more like, I'm not saying biotech, but like, like Uber at some point, was pretty clear it was going to take a lot of capital. And I think there are those businesses. I really think they're few and far between, and I don't think you need to decide that at the seed.
Right.
But yeah, there are moments when you just need a war chest. But again, I've probably seen more damage. We've definitely seen, as a fund, more damage from overcapitalization than under.
And then another point that I haven't seen in many other places, you talk about like the dangers of working with investors that partake in cross-fund investing. Why is that a big deal for potential founders?
I forget what the piece was about cross-fund investing.
It's like what to know about speedy capital deployers if they're in, they have multiple types of different funds or.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Some of these have created so many different vehicles that it's never clear what the decision criteria is for the other vehicle.
Yeah.
So, there's a little bit, and I think this is probably done with best intentions. It's like, hey, our opportunities fund is run by different people. But so somebody else has to make that decision. And you're sort of like in this funky situation where you're like, okay, well, you're already an investor. So now I have to go pitch somebody out. Like, do you get a vote? And I think all these funds are set up different ways. It's another thing I would ask, but especially if I were taking from a multi-stage fund, it's like, if you've got all these different if you have a fintech fund, a growth fund, you do SPVs, and you have an early stage fund, how do they all work?
Yeah.
And like, should I ever expect to get money from them? Or like, I just think knowing, eyes wide open going in, it doesn't mean you can't take money from them, but everybody's got their strengths and weaknesses, and you should know what those risks are going in.
That makes sense. I want to talk about, VCs that have strong social followings.
Yeah.
And then, counterpose that with folks that are like more of the, lack of a better term, like vanilla VCs that are chronically offline.
Yeah.
Completely offline. And I feel like sometimes there is this like, it's an unnecessary debate maybe, where it's like vanilla VCs, they're offline and they can provide value that you won't get from others. Why can't you do both?
I think you can do both. I'd like to think I do a little of both. Maybe, hopefully.
Right, because the investors that have the biggest audiences, it's not because they take the tried and true, like, tweet 11 times a day and then you'll find whatever. People follow them because they're really smart.
Yeah.
They have great views on investing in startups.
Yeah. I do think what's happened a little bit is, well, I'll just as an aside, I remember in dentistry, as we got deeper into the industry, I'd go to these dental labs and I'd be like, so tell me, who's the good dentist? The labs would know because they saw all the work.
Right.
And, it was always like the weird, not really sociable, good bedside manner dentist.
Yeah.
Ironically, the ones with the good bedside manner were the shitty dentists.
Oh, really?
And the ones, so it just like take that for granted.
Okay, yeah, fair enough.
And the weird, quirky ones
Yeah.
were always the good dentists for some reason.
Right.
I mean, not always, but mostly. So there may be some truth to that a little bit of like those who are so prolific and blog and, are constantly, may or may not be the best investors. I think they're, I think you have to separate the PR from the person. Because I think as I've got to meet a lot of these people who do have they are quite different in person. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. But I can speak to a bunch of people who I actually really do get along with, but sometimes I cringe when I read some of their stuff. But I do think it comes with a cost. I think, we do a bunch of events. We as you know, I write a fair bit.
Yeah.
It does take time.
Yeah.
I think it's a choice. I think it is a way in which I can get people to know my point of view on things. I do worry that we've entered a period where marketing is overtaking. Like there's almost a view of let me build a big brand and then let me write checks.
Right.
And the rest, I forget if it's deism or whatever. Like what will happen will happen. Right. Asian religion, the world, it's out of my hands. We don't believe that. Like we believe we can make an impact. We believe we have to stay involved. That doesn't mean micromanage.
Right.
And so I think, I guess for us, it's a balance of, getting out there enough so people know who we are and know what we're about, while focusing on the two things that really matter, which is investing in great entrepreneurs and helping them build great businesses. At the end of the day, that's all that really matters. My business partner, Eric, likes to say, everything else is a B activity.
Right.
So it's just a question of which B activities you're going to do. The only A activities are those first two things. So I think that's the argument for the vanilla, which is, I think there's some really good investors who just don't care about this stuff.
Right.
And maybe are kind of have a healthier, I always, as an aside, I always think about Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and how the biggest, most successful investment house is not on Wall Street.
Right.
And, is some of it just they're great? Sure. But maybe being out of the echo chamber was the best thing.
Yeah.
They weren't constantly on message with or bumping into people.
Probably not as reactive too.
Totally. And, I've lived in the Bay and I've lived here obviously and in Boston. And I think there's a lot of value to the density and this, and New York's becoming this way where we bump into each other and there's a lot of hey, what'd you hear? It has a lot of negatives too. The groupthink is real.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's time to move to Bentonville.
That makes sense. Looking at Omaha. That's right. Looking at Founder Collective's website and then your manifesto, one unique aspect is that you guys are all former founders. That lends some credibility, but also experience to folks that you're investing in. But then there's a line in there that you're we dilute alongside our founders.
Yeah.
I feel like that isn't talked enough about.
Yeah.
And in fact, many that's a big debate around dilution for investors. Do you feel like the incentives are off if that's not the case?
I do. I think. And I've been on the other side of this, and we're on the other side of this all the time.
Yeah.
I think one of the great lies perpetrated was that pro rata was a good thing for the founder. Pro rata is a one-way option for the VC. And
how so?
Well, because a lot of times companies need capital, and they can't say, hey, you got to do your pro rata. It's the VC's choice. Usually when the company needs capital and things aren't going so well, there's no pro rata to be had. When things are going great, then people are like, whoa, I want my pro rata, which actually sometimes makes the new round even more difficult, not easier. So I think what we said was, everybody says they're founder friendly, but how do you be structurally aligned to founders so that you actually have objectivity and are kind of aligned at the next round? And so what we said is we're going to write the first check. And the first one, we only wrote first checks. Now we'll write two checks. And the reason we write two checks is because usually you need two checks before you get sort of to that Series A or that sort of 0 to 1 stage. But after that, we're diluting alongside these founders. And so we can say that VC is treating you fairly, or, hey, I wouldn't take that deal. Whereas I think in other cases, you're negotiating against your VC, right? You're either, should the valuation go up, or should, so they can write, it's less dilutive, they hold at a higher markup, or do they want it at a lower price so they can buy more? Like now you're on the other side as your VC. They're supposed to be in it with you, right? They're supposed to, once they write a check, you should be a partner with, with your founders. So that's why we've set up the fund the way we have, which is to dilute alongside them, so that if someone comes around with a couple $100 million acquisition, we can objectively say, you've raised 1 or 2 rounds. This is not a crazy idea.
Yeah.
And no one else around the table usually, behaves that way.
Because of the incentives.
Because of the incentives.
Yeah. Makes sense. You've also written about winding down companies. And you bring up points about, how you've observed like either the messaging is off during this process, or there's not alignment between founders and VCs. So what is your founder-friendly guide? What is Micah's founder-friendly guide to winding down your company? Something that's like a delicate, very tough topic.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say whining. I do whine a lot, but about winding down.
Why do you whine so much?
I do. I'm cranky. I didn't have my coffee today. I think. I think about that know when to hold them, know when to fold them sort of thing. And I think in a market like we've had with so much venture capital and the power law stuff we talked about, there's a little bit of like, just keep going. And I think in some founders' heart of hearts, they're running out of gas and the TAM maybe not what they thought it was. And I'm sometimes the one saying, it's okay, like take the L and go work at a growth stage company and see, get your mojo, go on a beach for a little bit if you can afford it, or go to Google for a little bit and just, I think you got to have those conversations. I don't encourage people to give up. I think that's not the message. I think the message is to not artificially create a construct by which we're keeping our marks because like we want to keep our books, or we want to keep the perception that everything's hunky-dory. I think it's okay to have those honest conversations. As I was saying, I'm working on this thing, which I'll publish today or tomorrow, about pivoting, because I think that I'm seeing a bit more of that. And I think you can do that. I think you probably have one pivot before your team starts to lose their juice and the VCs. But I'm not afraid to have the conversation about should we give the money back?
Yeah.
And I think most VCs don't want the money back. And I think I've had this conversation where people are like, why do you care? And it's not the money so much as like, it's going to be a fraction of what we invested.
Right.
It's just that, is it a better use of all of our time and capital?
For other things.
For other things.
Yeah, that makes sense. On my subway ride this morning, I saw an ad for yet another HR platform that I've never heard before.
Okay.
Have we lost the script a little bit? Like, do you find that founders are aiming as high these days as they used to?
It's a really good question. I remember when I met Isaac at JustWorks, and we're now a customer of that platform.
We love JustWorks.
And I should have invested.
Yeah.
And I remember, and Isaac's great. And I remember, we've used the product for years, so we kick ourselves like we should have invested. But I had the same question of like, I started my companies on TriNet. It worked.
Yeah.
Whatever. Martin did a great job at that company.
Yeah.
So I do think the group think a little bit of like entrepreneurs maybe in some ways not, this goes back to the social media thing, like not being in the echo chamber and on Twitter and even Instagram is kind of healthy. I think one of the things that we benefited from, again, over a decade ago and 2 decades for Handshake was there was a lot less information. There was a downside, which is there weren't the Paul Graham essays. I wasn't as educated, certainly in my .com. But I also wasn't worried about everybody else's startup. There was certainly the buzz. Like I remember, the .com thing had a lot of buzz. But the level of like, just sort of feeling like everybody's doing a startup and like what idea can I come up with? Like you were a real outlier if you were doing entrepreneurship, if you were starting a business. You were a real outlier if you were doing it in the dental field. And yet a lot of these Uber was a car, was basically like a limo and taxi start. Like if you sort of abstract away, it was not a very sexy category at that moment. It later, became a big buzzy thing because it grew so much. So I think we are seeing a lot of incremental innovation because there's just a little bit of everybody feeding off each other. And I think the real breakthroughs come when you're like kind of break off from that and you think totally differently. I think one of the challenges, I think I wrote a little bit about this, I've been thinking a lot about this. How much of this AI revolution or whatever is going to look like the previous revolution? And if you continuously index off what happened in the past, you may come to the wrong conclusions. Like, so for example, is every function going to have like a SaaS-like product, or HR? Are there going to be 5 AI? Is the next JustWorks going to be AI? I'm not so sure. I don't think the future always looks just like the past.
Well, there's some like right now with like generative AI that feel like, product life cycles are so short now, and it's so easy to create something versus like 20 years ago where it took a lot of cloud storage. So what that means is the premium is on distribution versus the innate qualities of the product itself.
But inherently, if it's easy to build, the moat isn't very big. And so you might, and we've seen this.
Well, it becomes a brand exercise.
It becomes a brand exercise, but even then, I mean, it's amazing. I'm trying to think like Jasper or some of these content marketing things, how quickly they rose and fell. And so, yes, I think that's part of it. I think there's a lot of people who are like, okay, I know a particular problem. Let me slap an AI solution to that problem. And I think you just have to think fundamentally differently about it. Having said that, we've made some investments, I think, especially when you have domain expertise in an area. So like, I think we're investors in patented.ai, which is like using AI for patent defense and patent litigation. And I think if you know a lot about that domain, the USPTO is like a massive database of qualitative data that nobody's ever really, like, there literally could be patents that, are directly competing with each other because humans created this whole thing.
Right.
That's like a good use of AI. And I think, yes, ChatGPT could do all that, but I think how you sell, who you sell to, what the product, like that's pretty vertically specific. So I think there are those opportunities, but I think you're right. I think we're in a very, there's too many startups with like too much incremental innovation.
I want to give 2 hypotheses for why, and I want your reactions to them. The first one is that maybe the frontiers have changed on what those big Facebook, Google are. So 15 years ago, it was all about connectivity. Like, how could we connect people better, Facebook, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then it was like, okay, how do we do that for jobs, LinkedIn? But today the frontier is like space.
Right.
And like fewer people, unless you're like an extreme PhD, Elon Musk, or like an extreme expert in those things, the barrier to entry to that is higher. That's one hypothesis. Why we don't see as many like big leaps today. The second one is that maybe there's more opportunities for quick exits today than there were 15 years ago.
Yeah, I think there's probably some truth to both of those hypotheses. But I would say that, like, I don't think it's as binary as like space or like HR software. I mean, I think
that's the title of this YouTube.
Okay. Nailed it. We only took a half hour.
Let's go.
I think I remember when we met Cruise Automation, Kyle Vogt, who started Cruise, the driverless car. He was actually a summer intern who quit at our dental startup, Brontes. Dropped out of MIT and then went on to start Justin TV and then Cruise. The idea of a driverless car was like I hadn't thought of that. It was pretty wild. It wasn't space. Maybe you'd.
Well, I would include autonomous driving in that category.
In the space category.
Yeah, in the space
But
category.
I think there's things.
Like really, really tough challenges that like you couldn't do it 10 years ago.
But I think some of them are out there. We just, we're not seeing them as much. I mean, I think ChatGPT was a space. Like, it's just at that moment, by the way, ChatGPT got started, 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago now. So like at that moment, it was like, what are these guys doing? Like some learning model? That sounds pretty mundane. And then it comes out 8 years later and you're like, oh my God, that's like.
There's a strict before and after that.
Yeah. And we tend to be very retrospective. And I think, your comment, not to you know, bust, but like could be like, you know, that when back in the, what was it, 20s or something, was like, there are no more patents left to make, you know, to write.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's easy to be like, there's no more massive innovation, but I do agree with you. I think in general, with more entrepreneurship, there's a lot more incremental. People may not be taking as big of swings. But I still think it's net positive, like more entrepreneurial activity and more disruption in a good way, like trying to make better products, I think is generally good.
Yeah. One other thing you've written recently is a good indication about a VC and their investing habits is not how they treat their top 10%, their bottom 10%, but the middle 80%. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, you never know which company's going to break out.
Yeah.
If I look back at the companies we featured in each given year, like to our LPs, it is amazing how different. So that is just to say, particularly at seed and, you know, probably the A stage, the company who you perceive as really struggling could catch the tailwinds. I mean, think of Moderna, right? Like not, you know,
right.
But like you never know. COVID was a huge accelerant for a lot of things that you couldn't have predicted that in your wildest dreams. So I think that's the first thing, which is why you never like start to, we don't put things in quadrants. I don't think of it that way. I just think you make your reputation on those. I think you make your reputation on things that maybe don't go well, and entrepreneurs who you respond on the phone, you know, who like, I think a lot of VCs ghost a lot of the entrepreneurs. This goes back to the billion or bust. There's like a couple that are going to be the game changers, and you start to, I think almost psychologically sort of write off certain things. And I just think that's, I think there's an obligation. An investor has made a commitment. It's sort of like, you know, come hell or high water, rain or sleet, like, you know, we're a partner. And I think that builds your reputation. And I do think you can make a difference. And I think some of these, you know, again, some of it is our incentives and our small fund, which is, you know, getting them to an exit can make a difference to the fund. But I think it's also just the right thing to do. And I think those are the entrepreneurs who need you.
Yeah.
You know, the irony of this business is the companies, you know, the top 1%, the super outliers, at least in my experience, they grow so fast, they're so unusual that it actually becomes harder for investors to help, because like they've just captured the magic, and you don't want to get in the way of that.
Right.
I think it's everything else that's like, hey, you know, we're struggling with our head of engineering, or hey, we got a big churn problem, or the Series A is tough. That's when we're needed. And so anyway, I actually enjoy, like, I feel like it's where I can leverage my experiences and make a difference. And so sure, I'd love to have more Ubers, but that's not the nature of this business. And as I said, I think the obligation is a two-way obligation. Like, these aren't just businesses; these are humans, and you know, it's a finite number of portfolio companies we have. So I feel, you know, not only an obligation, but like, you know, it's the right thing to do.
My last question for you, as somebody who's been here in New York for a while, what's your favorite moment in the history of New York City tech?
My favorite moment. I want to ask you that question too. I have a lot of favorite moments. I mean, for me, I remember when Cornell Tech won the competition for Roosevelt Island. Yeah. I'm a Cornell grad, and I helped a little bit on the application, but Stanford seemed like the lock. Yeah. And then, you know, a donation happened, and that was pretty cool. I had some personal, like, you know, going to visit MakerBot as like a really early one. I remember, you know, Bloomberg was quite active, or I think back to the early days of Dave Tisch and Adam doing, you know, the accelerator here, Techstars in New York, and going to those events. Just some of the early formative ones were really fun. I don't know. How about you?
For me, it's like, especially, so I moved to New York 8 years ago. Okay. And in those early years, just seeing, like, in my day-to-day, how much New York tech influences it, from using Venmo with my friends, using ZocDoc to find my first doctor when I was here in New York, using a WeWork for the first time. Those are, every time I use those services, I'm like, this is New York, as somebody who's like prideful about this place. Yeah. So those are it for me.
I remember starting to see the like built in New York. I don't even know if they still do that. I remember like maybe that's like the second inning move.
Yeah.
Where you know.
Well, everybody when I ask folks about this, everybody brings up the New York Tech Meetup.
Yeah.
And that feels like it's not around anymore as much. But like folks that were here earlier days in New York, they all point to that as like a quintessential thing in the history of New York.
I think that's right. I mean, there are a whole bunch of events. I think Charlie's Shake Shack event was always like, and still is, a bit of a big event.
Yeah, I'll be there. I'm going in September.
Oh, good. Yeah. But I think now it's like much more diffuse. Like as you said that, I was thinking about Tech Week.
Yeah.
And people are like, hey, I'm coming in Tech Week and all this, and which events are you going to? And I'm like, is that a big deal? Like, there's so many events all year that this idea that there's 1 week of special events to me, and then as I reflect, it seems kind of funny. Like, you know, there's like 10 events, it seems, every week at this point.
Yeah.
And so the idea of a Tech Week almost seems to minimize like how big tech is in New York. And so I think that's actually speaks to how big it's gotten, is that like, some of the locals don't even go to the Tech Week stuff.
Well, I like interview folks like that were here in like early 2010s, like, you know, a little bit before that. And they're like, if you wanted to get investment here, you could have. Like everybody told you to go to other, you know, go to other cities. So it's almost like, you know, we take it, a lot of founders today may take that for granted, like how much this place has changed.
It is remarkable to me. If I think back to when I fundraised for both companies, there were probably 3 to 5 investors. There were probably 2 to 3 I could think of here. You know, Venrock, USV. I can't think of very many others when I was fundraising, and I did pitch those.
Yeah.
And then there were probably more in Boston, not many more, but Winter Street in Waltham, Mass. Had a handful. Matrix, Northbridge, those guys, and then the West Coast really had the monopoly on venture capital. Yeah. It is amazing how that has changed. I mean, you literally don't have to leave New York to raise capital. You know, I think at all stages, and a lot of those, you know, Silicon Valley firms have opened offices here.
Yeah.
So that's probably been the biggest change. I mean, the amount of I don't know which has grown faster, the amount of companies or the amount of VCs in New York City.
Okay, yeah.
But both have grown remarkably.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Micah.
Yeah,
I learned a ton
fun.
during this conversation. That's great.
Thanks for inviting me.